She didn't move.
Chef, the broth burned. I used my own recipe.
A cold smile.
Did I order you to do that?
But we have to serve it on time.
The smile vanished. He snatched the spoon, lifted the lid, sniffed.
What kind of swampy mixture is this? Did you put animal feed in it?
Grace's voice stayed low.
It's gumbo.
He didn't taste it. He dragged the pot to the sink at Maison Levine. 2 Michelin stars, Tribeca.
Garbage! Even a dog wouldn't eat this.
The amber broth poured down the drain. A waiter approached.
Chef!
At the kitchen door, a stranger in a charcoal suit stood. He wasn't looking at the chef. He was looking at her. 6 months from tonight, the whole world will taste that pot is to die for. 3 hours earlier, Maison Levine ran the way it always ran. Tribeca's most decorated French house. 2 Michelin stars for 11 straight years. A polished walnut dining room where a single tasting menu cost $385 and the reservation list closed 8 months in advance. The man at the top was Tobias Hargrove, 42 years old, executive chef since 2018. 2 James Beard semi-finalist nominations. Host of Hargrove's House on Bravo, Tuesdays at 9. His brand was technique, lineage, respect for the craft. In his kitchen, the dishwashers had no names. He called them by the number painted above their stations. Station 3, Station 5, Station 8. Grace Thornton was Station 8, 38 years old, 5th floor walk-up in Inwood. A hot plate, a cast-iron skillet, a single shelf of cookbooks. $50,000 in medical debt, what was left after her mother Yvette had died of pancreatic cancer 3 winters ago. The hospice bills, the morphine pump, the casket she had refused to pick from the cheaper catalog. Grace had washed dishes in 3 Manhattan kitchens since the funeral. Maison Levine was the 4th. She had worked the dish pit for 14 months without missing a shift, without speaking unless spoken to. What no one in that kitchen knew was that Grace had once been the top student in her class at the Culinary Institute of America. She had withdrawn 6 months before graduation when her mother got the diagnosis. She had never gone back. What no one knew either was the leather-bound journal on the top shelf of her locker. The cover was cracked. The pages had yellowed. The first entry was dated June 9th, 1962, in pencil, in the handwriting of her grandmother, Phaedra Thornton, a Gullah Geechee cook from Beaufort, South Carolina. Phaedra had filled the first 200 pages with recipes. Then, deliberately, she had left 60 pages blank at the back. The book is not finished, child. The book is never finished. That was the last thing Phaedra had ever written in it. Grace had been filling those blank pages for 6 years. Each entry dated, each entry a small experiment. Phaedra's Gullah originals rebuilt with the classical French techniques Grace had learned at the Institute. Clarification rafts, gastriques, stable emulsions. 60 pages of failure and discovery, written in pencil, locked in a dish pit 8 miles from where her grandmother had died. Page 64 was Gumbo, version 4. Grace had been testing it on a hot plate in her Inwood apartment for 6 months. She had never served it to anyone but herself. Every shift before tying her apron, Grace touched the spine of the journal once. A small ritual. A promise to her grandmother made every night for 14 months that the book would not stay closed. 2 people in that kitchen saw her. The first was Hayden Brennan, 28, a white sous chef Tobias had hired out of the French Laundry the year before. 3 weeks back, Hayden had broken a beurre blanc. The emulsion split, the sauce ran. He had been about to throw it out. As Grace walked past his prep counter with a tray of stemware, she set a single ice cube down on his marble without breaking stride. Hayden had stared at it. Then he had understood. He dropped the cube into the sauce, whisked, and the emulsion came back. He looked up to thank her. She was already gone. He had never said the words. The second was Reginald Sutton, 64 years old, black, Charleston born, 3 decades in fine dining. Every time Grace passed him in the service corridor, Reginald gave her a small nod. Once, he had asked her quietly, "You have a cook for your folks, baby?" Grace had paused. "Used to." Reginald nodded again. Thought so. Tonight was different. Tonight, Bravo's 8-camera crew was setting up for the photo shoot that would launch Crown of New York, the network's new docu-series, a tasting menu showdown among Manhattan's 1- and 2-star chefs. Tobias had been told he was the favorite. He had also been told that one of tonight's guests, a quiet man who had booked under the name M. Beaumont, was the Michelin inspector Maison Levine had been chasing a 3rd star with for 3 years. At 5:48 p.m., 48 minutes from service, Hayden Brennan stood at the consommé station, sweating into his collar. The clarified broth was the anchor of course 3. It needed 90 minutes to set. Tobias was upstairs in his office, adjusting his collar in the mirror. Grace walked past the consommé station. She glanced at the flame. She frowned. Once. She said nothing. She disappeared into the dish pick. The week before tonight, the kitchen had been teaching Grace something it teaches every black woman who works inside it long enough. There's a kind of cruelty that does not need a fist. It needs an audience. It started Monday. Tobias called an all-hands at 2 in the afternoon. Fresh whites, hands on his hips, laying out the week. The Bravo shoot, the tasting menu, the 3rd star push. When he got to the floor plan, he flicked a hand toward the dish pick. And let me be very clear. I don't want anyone from support staff near the dining floor during service. Customers don't pay $385 to look at. He waved his fingers in Grace's direction. Well, you know what I mean. A line cook laughed under his breath. Hayden Brennan stared at his knife. Reginald Sutton did not look at anyone. Grace kept folding. Wednesday made it worse. She was eating a wrap in the staff room, the journal open on her lap. Tobias passed the door, stopped. "What's this? Recipes? Did your mama leave you that?" Grace closed the journal. "Cute," he said. He walked away. 4 hours later, a notice appeared on the staff board. The staff room was now reserved for kitchen team and front of house only. Support staff would take meals in the basement. Signed, T. Hargrove. The basement had no chairs, no window. It smelled of bleach and brine. Grace carried a plastic chair down from storage and set it next to the trash bins. She ate the rest of her sandwich there. Friday made it law. Tobias hung a varnished oak frame by the pass. Inside, an embossed card titled Maison Levine, Standards of Service. Rule 4 said dish pit staff would not engage with plating stations. Rule 6 said dish pit staff would not speak unless directly addressed. Rule 8 said failure was grounds for immediate termination. The frame named no one. The kitchen knew who it was for. By Sunday, Grace had been told 3 times she was less than the porcelain she washed. She kept touching the spine of the journal every night before she tied her apron. At 6:32 on Sunday, Hayden Brennan made his mistake. He turned the flame too high. The raft broke. The broth scorched. Hayden poured it down the drain and started a new batch, knowing it needed 90 minutes and service began in 50. Tobias hissed something at him and went back upstairs. At 6:51, Grace untied her apron. She walked to the back burner where her own pot had been simmering since 4:53 that morning. Oxtail, smoked turkey neck, blue crab shells, spices ground at lunch on the basement prep counter. This was page 64. Gumbo, version 4. The recipe she had tested on a hot plate in Inwood for 6 months and never served to anyone but herself. She built a raft of egg white and tomato, strained through muslin into a clean pot, finished with okra coins, lump crab, a single Gulf shrimp, and a crown of micro celery. 9 bowls. She ladled. Reginald lifted the tray. At table 7, the quiet man in a charcoal suit had reserved under the name M. Beaumont. Reginald set the bowl in front of him with both hands. "Phaedra's consommé, sir. The chef hopes you'll find the okra agreeable." The man looked up. Phaedra was not on the menu. He bent over the bowl, smelled, picked up the spoon. He tasted once, set the spoon down, tasted again, a third time. He did not finish. He took a leather notebook from his breast pocket and wrote 3 lines in pencil. At table 4, Adrian Lockwood, owner of 2 boutique restaurants in the West Village, stopped mid-conversation with her wife. She had recognized the hand. She mouthed a word her wife did not catch. Grace. At 8:11, Monsieur Beaumont stood and walked toward the kitchen door. The maitre d', Preston Vaughn, stepped into his path. "Sir, the kitchen is restricted during service." Monsieur Beaumont opened his billfold, removed a leather card, showed it. Preston Vaughn went the color of bleached linen. He stepped aside. Just then Tobias came down from his office. He walked into a kitchen that was humming and a dining room he could hear murmuring through the doorway. He followed the prep trail to the back burner, where Grace stood, rinsing her ladle. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Grace didn't move. "Chef, the broth burned. I used my own recipe." A cold smile. "Did I order you to do that?" "But service starts soon." The smile vanished. He snatched the spoon, lifted the lid of her pot, sniffed. "What kind of swampy mixture is this? Did you put animal feed in it?" Grace's voice stayed low. "It's gumbo." He didn't taste it. He carried the pot, still 3/4 full, to the dish sink at the pass. He stopped under the oak frame that read, "Standards of Service." He tilted the pot. Garbage. Even a dog wouldn't eat this. Amber broth poured down the drain. 14 hours of work. Gone in 11 seconds. Reginald stepped forward. "Chef, stay out of this, Reggie." Tobias looked at Grace, the cold smile again. "Stick to the dishes, sweetheart. Cooking is for people who've earned it." The kitchen door opened. M. Beaumont walked in. He did not look at Tobias. He walked past him, close enough that their sleeves brushed, and stopped in front of Grace. "Madame, the consommé. Was that your hand?" Grace's hands were wet. "Yes." "What is your name?" "Grace Thornton." He wrote it in the notebook. Tobias laughed, thin and false. "Sir, there's been a kitchen miscommunication." M. Beaumont did not turn around. "I tasted the bowl that came out, Chef Hargrove. There was no miscommunication in the bowl." He took a cream-colored business card from his pocket, laid it on the steel counter beside Grace's elbow. He did not hand it to her. He turned to face Tobias for the first time. "I will be in touch with your house." The word house sat in the air. Every cook in that brigade understood it had not been spoken to Tobias alone. Monsieur Beaumont walked back through the door. It swung closed behind him. Tobias stood in his own kitchen with an empty stockpot in his hands. He walked to Grace's open locker, flipped the journal open with one finger, scanned a page. Pencil, 1962. He snorted. "What is this? A cookbook for housekeepers?" He let it fall shut and walked out without nodding to a single member of his brigade. The cream-colored card sat on the counter at Grace's elbow. She did not touch it. She turned the tap back on and finished washing the tureen. Service ended at 11:18. The line cooks scrubbed down. Hayden Brennan left without making eye contact with anyone. Reginald Sutton stood at the corridor door, hat in his hands. Tobias did not acknowledge him. Grace washed the last of the stemware. She dried her hands on a clean towel. She walked to the steel counter where the cream-colored business card had been sitting since 8:11 that evening. She picked it up. The name was embossed in a thin sans serif. Henri Beaumont. Beneath it, a Paris telephone number. Nothing else. No company, no title, no address. Grace tucked it inside the journal, between page 64 and page 65. She rode the A train home in silence, 14 stops, Inwood, the 5th floor walk-up. She turned the kitchen light on. She did not eat. She sat at the small wooden table by the window and opened the journal to the dedication page Phaedra had written in 1962, in pencil, that had not faded in 64 years. For Yvette, and for Yvette's child, and for whoever comes after. What they call worthless, you call inheritance. Grace read it twice. She closed her eyes. She heard her grandmother's voice the way she had heard it as a child, the rhythm of low-country speech. She spoke to no one, to the empty apartment, to a woman who had been dead for 19 years. What they call garbage is my grandmother's gold. She did not call the Paris number, not that night, not the next morning. She went back to work on Monday in a gray apron. She washed dishes for 14 hours. She washed dishes for 14 hours the day after. 3 weeks passed. In those 3 weeks, Bravo put Hargrove's house on what they called a creative pause. The Tuesday night ratings had been sliding for 2 quarters. The 3rd-star verdict from Michelin had not arrived. The Crown of New York docuseries was being rewritten without Tobias as the unofficial favorite. Tobias became paranoid. He could not identify who had put Henri Beaumont in his kitchen. He suspected Reginald. He suspected Hayden. He kept circling back to the dish pit, back to the locker, back to the leather-bound journal he had called a cookbook for housekeepers. He decided to clean house. On a Friday afternoon at 4:48, Tobias called Grace into his office. Hayden Brennan stood by the door. The front-of-house manager, a woman named Diana Ashford, held a folder. Tobias did not look up from his desk. We're missing a tin of black truffle salt from the dry goods inventory. $480. The lockers were inspected this morning. Yours had irregular contents. Grace said nothing. I'm terminating your employment for theft. Out of courtesy to your service here, we won't be pressing charges. Your final check will be mailed. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk. A non-disparagement agreement. Grace read it. She did not pick up the pen. Tobias finally looked at her, the cold smile. You can sign it, or you can walk out without your last paycheck. Your choice, sweetheart. Grace stood. She did not sign. She did not argue. She walked out of the office and down to the locker room. She emptied her locker into her canvas knapsack, apron, knife roll, a spare pair of socks, the journal. She walked out the service door at 5:06 p.m. That night, on the fire escape outside her 5th-floor window, Grace sat on the iron grate with the journal on her lap and the cream-colored card in her hand. The November wind moved her hair. Below, a delivery truck reversed into a hydrant on Dykeman Street. She turned the card over. She turned it back. She dialed the Paris number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, 4 times. A voice answered, calm, lightly accented, the voice of a man who had been expecting this call for 3 weeks. Henri Beaumont? Grace's voice did not shake. This is Grace Thornton. I'm ready. There was a pause on the other end. Not surprise, recognition. Mademoiselle Thornton. Where can I meet you tomorrow morning? Grace looked at the journal on her lap and at the November sky over the Hudson and at the city she had washed dishes in for 8 years without ever once standing at a stove in front of paying strangers. She smiled. The first smile she had smiled in 3 weeks. Anywhere there's a stove. The next morning, Henri Beaumont sat across from Grace at a stainless steel countertop in a small test kitchen in Brooklyn. He had flown in on the red-eye. I cannot invest in you, Mademoiselle Thornton. Michelin does not allow it. The night I tasted your consommé, I became an inspector who has identified a chef. Any direct financial stake from me would end my career and would, frankly, end your future star. Grace nodded once. She had assumed nothing else. I have a friend. She lives 12 blocks north of where we sit. Her name is Camille Dufour. She owned a small hotel in Lyon for 42 years. She retired to Harlem to be close to her daughter. She has been looking for one project to put her own money behind before she stops looking. I told her, last night, that I had found the project. He slid a piece of paper across the counter, a telephone number, no name. Call her tomorrow. The decision is yours. Grace called the next afternoon. Camille Dufour answered on the first ring. Her voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of a woman who had run a hotel through 3 French presidents. They met that Friday at a coffee shop on Frederick Douglass Boulevard. Camille was 71 years old, wore a wool coat the color of dark cherry, and ordered an espresso. She did not ask what Grace had cooked. She asked what her grandmother had cooked, what her mother had cooked, what Grace cooked for herself on a Sunday night when no one was watching. By the end of the second espresso, Camille had agreed to fund the build-out. $480,000, a passive equity stake. Grace would hold full creative control. The space Grace chose was a 24-seat shotgun storefront on Lenox Avenue, 2 blocks from the Apollo. The previous tenant had been a dry cleaner for 31 years. The tin ceilings had not been painted since 1968. Grace signed the lease on the last Friday in September. She taped a photograph above the new prep counter. It was the only photograph anyone had taken of her grandmother. Phaedra Thornton on a wooden porch in Beaufort, South Carolina, in front of a hand-painted sign that read, Phaedra's Kitchen. The year in the corner was 1968. Phaedra wore a flour-dusted apron and held a wooden spoon. The new restaurant would carry her grandmother's name, Phaedra's Table. The construction took 6 weeks. On the second Monday of the build, Reginald Sutton walked through the front door without an appointment. He wore a black tie and held a manila folder. I came to give my notice at Maison Levine yesterday, he said. He set the folder on the sawhorses Grace was using as a counter. Inside, his pension papers, his service record, a folded white linen napkin. Reginald, you don't have to. Baby, I've been waiting 40 years to serve a room that knew my grandmother's name. I'm not waiting another 40. That was the day Phaedra's Table got its maitre d'. The menu Grace built was a 5-course tasting around the Gullah Geechee canon she had been carrying since childhood. She crab, hopping john, Benny wafer, smothered chicken, sweet potato pone. Each dish reverse-engineered through the classical French techniques she had learned at the Culinary Institute. Clarification rafts, gastriques, stable emulsions. The signature course was the 3rd course, Phaedra's consommé, the 14-hour broth. The dish she had ladled on a Sunday night in Tribeca and watched a man pour down a drain. Phaedra's Table opened on a Wednesday in mid-November. The first 6 weeks were quiet. The kitchen was busy, the dining room was full 4 nights a week. Grace cooked, Reginald greeted every guest by name within 3 visits. Then Tobias Hargrove found out. He did not threaten the fish supplier. He did not call a journalist. He went straight at the only thing that mattered. A cease and desist letter arrived at Phaedra's Table at the end of February. Written by a law firm Maison Levine had retained for 11 years. The claim was careful. It did not say the recipe belonged to Maison Levine. It said that Grace Thornton, during her 14 months of paid employment, had developed a proprietary fusion variant, a Gullah Geechee base clarified by classical French technique, and that any commercial use violated the NDA she had signed at hire. The accusation was dangerous because it was half true. The clarification step was a hybrid. The hybrid had to be proven older than the hire date. Grace called Adrian Lockwood, the woman at table 4, within an hour. Adrian sent her to Olivia Harrington, a chef's IP attorney with 2 decades on the docket. Olivia drove up to Harlem that night and asked to see the journal. She turned the pages slowly. She found page 64. The entry was dated June 14th, 2 years before Grace had walked into Maison Levine for the first time. The heading in Grace's pencil read, Version 4, clarified by classical raft technique, tested April through October. Below that, in pencil that had not faded in 64 years, was Phaedra Thornton's own original. June 9th, 1962. The clarification step was already there. Phaedra had used egg white and crushed tomato. She had written in the margin, "I learned this from the Frenchman my mother cooked for in 1928, folded into our broth." Olivia looked up. "Grace, this isn't a fusion variant. This is the original recipe. Your grandmother's clarification predates Tobias Hargrove's birth certificate by 22 years. Grace closed the journal. Her hand stayed flat on the cover. She said quietly to no one in particular, "What they called garbage was on this page before they had a name for it." Olivia drafted a response brief that week. The paper was carbon dated at the NYU Conservation Center. The leather was authenticated by a textile historian who had spent her career on antebellum bindings. Tobias Hargrove's law firm withdrew the cease and desist 16 days later. No public statement, no concession. They simply stopped. But Tobias did not stop. On a Tuesday in late March, a man in a navy suit walked into Phaedra's table without a reservation and asked for the chef. He took a seat at the chef's counter and ordered the third course. He ate in silence. He set the spoon down. He introduced himself. "My name is Spencer Knox. I am the executive producer of Crown of New York on Bravo. Tobias Hargrove has asked the network to put you in the finale. Head-to-head, same course, live broadcast, 3 judges, blind tasting, no editing." He set a business card on the counter beside her elbow. He did not hand it to her. "Are you in?" 3 days after Spencer Knox set the business card on the counter at Phaedra's table, the Michelin Guide held its annual New York announcement at Pier 60 on the Hudson River. 380 guests in black tie, cameras live streaming to YouTube and to the network food channels. 3 rows reserved at the front for the chefs receiving new stars that year. Grace wore her own whites. No monogram, no logo. Pinned to her left breast was a folded handkerchief of her grandmother's, the one with the small embroidered honeybee in the corner. Reginald sat beside her in a black suit. The journal rested closed on her lap. The master of ceremonies announced new stars by borough: Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens. When the speaker reached Harlem, the room quieted in the way a room quiets when it senses what is about to happen. From Harlem, a restaurant that opened just 4 months ago on Lenox Avenue. 24 seats. The kitchen is run by a chef who, 6 months ago to this very night, was washing dishes in a kitchen in Tribeca. A murmur rolled across the floor. Phaedra's table. 1 Michelin star. Chef Grace Thornton. Grace stood. She did not bow, she did not wave. She carried the journal in her right hand and walked to the podium. A Michelin staff member brought out the dish under the studio lights. A deep porcelain bowl. Amber broth, clarified clean. Okra coins, lump crab, a single Gulf shrimp, a crown of micro celery. The same bowl that had been ladled in Tribeca on a Sunday in late October. The same broth that had run down a steel drain. Steam rose under the lights the way steam had risen from the sink that night. The bowl was placed on the podium beside the microphone. Grace opened the journal to the dedication page. She laid her hand flat across her grandmother's pencil. She looked up at the room. 6 months ago tonight, in a kitchen 6 miles south of here, a man poured this exact soup down a drain. He called it garbage. He said even a dog wouldn't eat it. The room was absolutely still. This bowl came from a recipe my grandmother Phaedra wrote in 1962, in Beaufort, South Carolina, in pencil, in a journal that has never left my family. Tonight, the same bowl wears a Michelin star. She raised the journal slightly. So if anyone in this room is wondering, yes, tonight, garbage wears a star. The applause did not start at the front. It started at a single table at the back, a woman in her 60s standing up first, then a chef in his 50s, then the entire room. Reginald stood at his seat with both hands raised above his head. Within 36 hours, the New York Times food desk published a long-form profile titled the dishwasher who was always a chef. The article excavated Grace's history piece by piece, top of her class at the Culinary Institute of America from 2014 to 2016, withdrawn 6 months before graduation when her mother got the diagnosis. 8 years of dishwashing across 3 Manhattan kitchens, Maison Levine the fourth. Adrian Lockwood gave the article one quote: "Grace was the most talented student in our cohort. We all thought she'd be running her own kitchen by 30. Then her mother got sick and Grace did what Grace does. She went quiet and did what had to be done." That night at 11:08, in the empty dining room of Phaedra's table, Grace laid the journal on the chef's counter and opened it to the dedication page. Reginald was the only other person in the room. She read it aloud for the first time, out loud, in her own kitchen. "For Yvette, and for Yvette's child, and for whoever comes after. What they call worthless, you call inheritance." Reginald closed his eyes. Across the river in a corner apartment in Tribeca, Tobias Hargrove watched the press feed from a leather chair. His phone had been ringing for 2 hours. He had not picked up. He poured a bourbon. He read the Times profile twice. He closed the laptop. He picked up the phone and dialed Spencer Knox. "I'll do it. Same course. Live. Just me and her. 3 weeks." The next morning, Spencer Knox held a press conference outside the Bravo studios in Long Island City. The crown of New York finale would be a single-course showdown: Tobias Hargrove versus Grace Thornton. Each chef would prepare the dish that started the feud. 3 judges, blind tasting, live, unedited. 3 weeks out. Studio 8B at the Bravo broadcast facility in Long Island City held 220 seats. 2 cooking stations had been built mirrored, separated by a black velvet curtain that ran from the ceiling to the floor. Identical pantries, identical equipment. 3 hours on the clock. 3 judges seated behind a partition where neither chef could see them. The judges were named in the morning press release: Henry Beaumont, Senior Inspector for the Michelin Guide North America. His identity made public for the first time in his 31-year career. Vivienne Marchand, 3 Michelin star chef from Lyon, in town to deliver a guest lecture at the Culinary Institute. Damon Whitaker, lead food critic for the New York Times. Tobias Hargrove had spent the 3 weeks reverse engineering what he had eaten the night the bowl arrived in his pass. He flew a Gullah cuisine consultant up from a culinary school in Charleston and paid her to write him a printed sheet of weighed ingredients and timed phases. He read 4 cookbooks. He treated the dish as a recipe to be executed. He did not treat it as a lineage to be carried. Grace spent the same 3 weeks differently. She read her grandmother's journal cover to cover for the 5th time. On a margin in 1968, in Phaedra's pencil, she found a single sentence she had read a dozen times without ever quite hearing. "The broth tells you who held the pot before you. Listen with your nose, not your hands." The night before the broadcast, Grace pressed a small batch of Beniseed oil by hand at the prep counter of Phaedra's table. The seeds toasted in a dry skillet. She crushed them in a stone mortar her grandmother had used for 60 years. She wrapped the paste in muslin and pressed by hand, slowly, into a small glass jar. The oil came out the color of pale honey and smelled of sesame and warm earth. It was not in any cookbook. It would not come from a printed sheet. Tobias could not have stolen it. On filming morning, Tobias entered the studio first. Polite applause, pressed whites. He waved to the cameras and took his station. Grace entered in her own whites, the journal tucked under her right arm. She set the journal on the corner of her station, then she tied her apron. Vivienne Marchand spoke through the partition microphone. "Chef Thornton, what is the journal?" Grace's voice was steady. "My grandmother's handwriting." She held the pot before me. Spencer Knox called the clock. 3 hours. Begin. The first 60 minutes belonged to Tobias's confidence. He worked fast and clipped, bones into a hot pan, mirepoix in a measured cup, The herb sachet weighed to the gram against the printed sheet of Gullah aromatics his consultant had prepared. The cameras loved him. His face was made for the lens. Grace worked slowly. She did not consult a sheet. She did not weigh. She was humming, a low country hymn her grandmother had hummed over a pot, and the mics picked it up. The hum carried through the studio speakers. The audience stopped fidgeting. At minute 51, a pantry runner brought Grace a tray of blue crab. What the audience did not see was Tobias intercepting the same runner backstage 4 minutes earlier. The runner was a 21-year-old culinary intern named Hannah Reyes. Tobias told her to take Grace's crab back and double-check it for shell fragments. Code for delay her by half an hour. Hannah Reyes did not do that. She walked onto the broadcast floor with the tray of crab still in her hands and her phone in her apron pocket. She approached Spencer Knox at the host's stand. The microphones were live. "Mr. Knox, Chef Hargrove just asked me to delay Chef Thornton's ingredients." The studio went silent. Spencer's voice carried across the floor. "Chef Hargrove, are you asking production to delay a competitor's ingredients?" Tobias straightened up from his station, the cold smile. "Absolutely not. There must be a misunderstanding." Hannah Reyes held up her phone. The text message was on the screen. The timestamp was 90 seconds old. She read it aloud. "Take her crab back. Tell her it needs a repick. Take your time." Spencer Knox paused the broadcast for 30 seconds while he conferred with the Bravo standards officer behind the host stand. The cameras did not cut. He returned to his mark and addressed the live feed. "For the record, any further interference with Chef Thornton's station or ingredients will be grounds for immediate disqualification. We continue." The audience reacted audibly. The clock resumed. The second hour belonged to Tobias's mistake. At minute 84, his clarification raft broke. The egg white and mirepoix lid cracked under the heat. The broth turned cloudy. The same mistake Hayden Brennan had made 6 months earlier in a kitchen 6 miles away. Tobias did not have time to start over. He strained what he had through cheesecloth twice and accepted a broth that was clearer than failure and cloudier than honor. His jaw set. He did not look at Grace's station. Grace's raft set clean. The proteins floated to the top in a single golden lid, the way her grandmother had described in the margin of page 19. She strained through muslin held in the 4 hands of Reginald Sutton, who had been allowed onto the floor as her sole assistant. Reginald did not speak. He held the cloth steady. His knuckles whitened. The third hour belonged to plating. Tobias built with French precision, a flat porcelain bowl, a careful arrangement, 3 okra coins fanned, a single lump of crab centered, a thin drizzle of chive oil. Beautiful, exact, controlled. Grace plated differently. She used a deep porcelain bowl. The broth was poured tableside into the bowl in front of each judge from a small cast-iron pot her grandmother had used in Beaufort. 3 Benny wafers were laid on the rim. A single drop of the hand-pressed Benny seed oil floated on the surface of the amber broth. At minute 178, both bowls were carried behind the judge's partition. Bowl A, Bowl B. Neither chef could see which judge tasted which. Henry Beaumont lifted his spoon over Bowl A first. He tasted. He set the spoon down. He did not change his expression. He tasted Bowl B. Same expression. He laid the spoon across the rim. Vivienne Marchand tasted both. She set her spoon down and spoke to the room in English, slow and even. One of these was cooked. The other was told. Damon Whitaker spoke last. I can describe the technique in Bowl A. I cannot describe what is in Bowl B. That is the difference. The judges deliberated for 4 minutes behind the partition. The audience did not breathe. Spencer Knox called the chefs to the front of the stage. The black curtain dropped. Henri Beaumont stood. He picked up the microphone. Bowl A is technically excellent. Classical raft, clean broth, a respectful study of a tradition that does not belong to the chef who made it. Bowl B is something else. Bowl B tastes like a recipe that has been in someone's family for 64 years. Bowl B is the winner. Spencer Knox flipped the labeled cards on the judge's table. Bowl A, Tobias Hargrove. Bowl B, Grace Thornton. Henry turned to the camera. He spoke to the live audience watching at home and to the studio audience standing in the dark behind the lights. I should add, for transparency and for the audience at home, I was at Maison Le Vin 6 months ago, on the night Chef Thornton plated this dish for the first time. I watched the executive chef pour it down a drain while he called it garbage. I have waited 6 months to taste it again. I am pleased it tastes the same. The studio audience came to its feet. Reginald Sutton, still at Grace's station, wiped one eye with the muslin still in his hand. He did not lower the cloth. He stood holding it like a flag. Grace was very still. She picked up the journal from the corner of her station. She opened it to the dedication page. She laid her hand flat across her grandmother's pencil. She did not speak. Tobias had not spoken since the curtain dropped. The cameras held on his face. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. Spencer Knox stepped beside him with the microphone. Chef Hargrove, a word for the audience? Tobias looked at Grace across the floor. The cold smile was gone. It was not coming back. He breathed in once. It was the better dish. Spencer Knox stepped to the center of the stage. He held the official scorecard signed by all 3 judges. Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of the first Crown of New York and the recipient of the network's $250,000 culinary grant, Chef Grace Thornton. The studio was already on its feet. The cameras tracked Grace across the floor. She did not raise her arms. She walked to the host's stand with the journal in her right hand. Spencer held out the prize envelope. Grace looked at it. She did not take it. She turned to the microphone. I'd like to use the prize money to start a scholarship. Every dollar. It will be called the Yvette Thornton Scholarship, after my mother. It will go to first-generation Black women entering the Culinary Institute of America. 1 full ride a year. 5 years. The room stood again. Reginald applauded with both hands above his head. Adrienne Lockwood, on her feet at the back, was the first to put her fingers in her teeth and whistle. Olivia Harrington mouthed something from the front row that the cameras did not catch. Henri Beaumont stepped to the microphone before Spencer could close the segment. I should also share, while we are being transparent, that I returned to Maison Le Vin twice in the months after that night. Each visit confirmed what the first had taught me. A house can hold 2 stars and still fail the people inside it. Spencer turned to the lens. Chef Thornton, one question. What would you say to anyone at home who has ever been told that what they had was garbage? Grace looked into the camera lens directly. 6 months ago, a man called this soup garbage. Tonight, the world tasted what he refused to see. Sometimes the only difference between garbage and gold is who is allowed to hold the spoon. She lifted the journal. She tucked it under her arm. She did not bow. She walked off the set. The cameras stayed on Spencer Knox. He turned to the lens, his face composed. Stay with us. After the break, the question everyone is asking. What happens now to Tobias Hargrove? Within 48 hours, Bravo canceled Hargrove's house. The network's official statement cited the integrity incident during the finale broadcast. Hannah Reyes's text message had been replayed on every food channel in the country. Within 10 days, Maison Le Vin fired Tobias. The decision came after internal reporting from the kitchen brigade, prompted by the broadcast. Line cooks who had stayed silent for 6 years suddenly remembered every belittling word. Hayden Brennan was among them. He signed a formal statement on a Tuesday afternoon and did not look at the door when he left. Within 30 days, the James Beard Foundation rescinded Tobias's 2 previous semifinalist nominations after a member-led review. He was removed from the Beard House guest chef rotation indefinitely. Within 60 days, the Michelin Guide did something it almost never does. It adjusted a rating mid-cycle. Maison Levine lost one of its 2 stars. The unofficial trigger was Henri Beaumont's on-air testimony, a public record audit event the Guide's internal review could not overlook. Reservations dropped 64% in the first week after the announcement. The restaurant closed within 4 months. The Tribeca space went on the market by midsummer. 6 months after the finale, Tobias Hargrove gave an interview to Vanity Fair from a rented house outside Sonoma. He attempted a public apology. The internet did not accept it. He did not cook professionally again. Across the river, Phaedra's table was fully booked through the following calendar year within 72 hours of the broadcast. Grace declined 3 television offers. She declined 2 cookbook deals. She declined a Las Vegas residency. She accepted 1 project, a small Harlem publisher's children's book about a grandmother and her granddaughter sharing a pot of soup. The royalties were directed in full to the Yvette Thornton Scholarship. Reginald Sutton's name was added to the menu of Phaedra's table in the same point size as Grace's own. Olivia Harrington became the restaurant's standing counsel and, later, the founding board chair of the scholarship. 1 year later, Grace and Adrian Lockwood opened a second concept together, a small community kitchen attached to the back of Phaedra's table that served free hot meals 4 nights a week. The volunteers were alumni of the scholarship. A few were former dishwashers themselves. The journal was donated on permanent loan to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem. It was placed in a climate-controlled glass case beside a small bronze placard that read, "Recipes are inheritances. The hand that writes them is sometimes the only thing that survives." School children toured the case on field trips. Grace gave the inaugural Schomburg lecture that fall. The title was What They Called Garbage. The room was full. The hand-pressed Beniseed oil, the ingredient Tobias could never have stolen, became the only product Phaedra's table sold retail. Each bottle was labeled by hand and numbered, starting from 1962. Every profit went to the scholarship. 1 year to the day after the broadcast, Grace stood alone in Phaedra's table at closing time. The cook line had been wiped down, the chairs had been turned upside down on the tables. The journal sat closed on the chef's counter beside her. She looked up at the photograph of her grandmother on the wall behind the pass. She spoke to it, quietly, the way she had spoken to it on the night the soup went down a drain, and on the night the star was announced, and on the night the curtain dropped. She spoke to the photograph. "You said they could not take it if I put it on paper, so I put it on paper, so I put it on a plate, so I put it on a stage. And now they cannot take it from anyone." She turned off the kitchen light. 3 things to remember from a story like this one. First, what the powerful discard is often what they could not understand. A pot is a pot. A bowl is a bowl. A name is a name. What gives them weight is the hand that holds them and the lineage that hand carries. Second, inheritance is not money. Inheritance is memory written down. Phaedra Thornton, in 1962, in a kitchen in Beaufort, South Carolina, could not have known that a sentence in pencil would, 64 years later, defeat a New York law firm's brief and a television network's machinery. She wrote anyway. She wrote because she could not know. Third, the most dangerous evidence against an arrogant man is the work he tried to throw away. Tobias Hargrove poured Grace Thornton's soup down a drain because he did not believe it could matter. The soup mattered. The soup is still mattering. If you watched a story like this and something inside you moved, that is the part of you that recognizes lineage when it walks into a room. That is the part of you that knows what your grandmother was, and what your mother was, and what you carry into a kitchen of your own. Talent does not vanish when the world refuses to see it. It waits. It writes. It returns. If this story spoke to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel. The next story is being written by someone whose name nobody knows yet. In a quiet kitchen on Lenox Avenue, a light goes out behind a window. From the street, the dining room glows for one more beat. Then the night closes over Phaedra's table. Tomorrow, the door opens again. #Phaedra's table. #what they called garbage.